Okay, so our next speaker is Paul Abreu, who's going to talk to us about the GPE energy networks and smart meter program and using network operators to use that data.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I'm pleased to be here and just give you an insight into a data access challenge that our members, the electricity network operators, have. I work for Energy Networks Association, and our association represents all the gas and electricity transmission and distribution companies in Great Britain and Ireland. And an important distinction to make here is that our members are not the suppliers that send you the bill for your gas or electricity. We are the network operators. Our members own the infrastructure that delivers that energy to your home. So in today's short presentation, I'll give you a quick overview of the smart meter program and the functionality and data that's available from the smart metering system to our members, and we'll specifically look at half-hourly electricity consumption data, as that is a specific item of data that needs anonymisation, and then we'll look at restrictions on access to that data because of it being personal, and what DNOs are doing to try and get hold of that information to deliver benefits to their customers. So the smart meter program is a mandated program, and suppliers have the obligation to deliver 53 million meter replacements before 2020. The mass rollout of those replacements, every gas and electricity meter in your home will be replaced by 2020. The mass rollout starts next year, and consumers will be able, once they have these smart meters, will be able to look in near enough real time at their consumption, and they'll be able to share that consumption detail with approved third parties like switching sites and try and get the best tariffs for themselves. This is very much part of a much larger project to provide smart grid across GB and to enable that transition to a low carbon future. Network operators don't install the meters, but they are legitimate users of the DCC system that will enable connectivity to those meters and the data it contains. It's important to say that the data in this system only exists in every meter that's in the meter that's in your home and nowhere else. The DCC, the data communication company, provides the infrastructure to get at that data. It's just a tube, it's just a communications channel for the approved users of the system to access the data contained in the meter in your home. There's a number of things like alerts that network operators will receive and lots of information stored in the meter that network operators can access. One of those items, the item in red that I've shown here in this slide, has been categorised as personal information and is subject to much more stringent privacy controls, and that's the one we're going to be talking about now today. The others, there's the usual controls, but not so stringent because it's not warranted as personal data. So a typical half-hourly profile stored in the electricity meter looks like this, and this is a 48 plot over your normal day, and these are 13 months rolling 13 months worth of daily data that's stored in the meter, and you can start to work out what the consumer behaviours are by looking at their half-hourly profile. So why do electricity network operators want access to this data? Traditionally, energy has flowed one way in their networks. Things are starting to change. They're very much more challenging sort of dynamics within the electricity distribution network. Network operators are incentivized to run the most efficient and economic network possible to keep network costs as low as possible for consumers, and they're incentivized by the regulator to do that. But in this changing smart environment, the flows with more localized generation are starting to show different behaviors, and it's important for networks to be ahead of the game and enable the network to be ready for consumers to take their smart choices and to have energy, and interact with energy in different ways than they've always done. So it's really important to get access to that data. So there's no physical barrier in the smart metering system to stop a network operator accessing this half-hourly data. There's only a legislation. The barriers only exist in legislation, in their license conditions, and obviously the contents of the Data Protection Act as well. So, but accessing half-hourly consumption data with the data that they extract comes the meter point administration number and the device ID reference number, and with either of those items and other data sets they can identify the customer, so that's why this is a particularly sensitive area. So where are the legislation barriers for networks in this regard? And that is very much in their distribution license, and none of the network operators want to be in breach of license, so they make absolutely certain, that's one of the things they most focus their attention on, is being license compliant. There is a license prohibition on then obtaining this half-hourly consumption data. There are 3 ways that they can obtain it currently in the license, and that is that they can get the explicit consent from each customer, and they have to sort of write the customer and ask that individually, and that's not really that practical for them because customers move house, and it's keeping that is really not practical to keep that managed. That if they suspect illegal abstraction of electricity or theft, they can access that data, or if they want to have a study or a network trial, they can ask the customers and give them 14 days notice, and if the customer doesn't object, they can access that half-hourly consumption data. So the SLC 10A, this license condition, exists, as well as they're also required to comply with the Data Protection Act. So there are, in the license, there's exceptions to this prohibition, and that is that the network operator has to submit a data access and privacy framework to the regulator, Ofgem, and it's very important that in the words of that, I put the words there in red, the words within that prohibition exception in the license actually requires that the network operator, through its aggregation with other electricity consumption data, anonymises that information, and we've sort of met with Mark to talk about this challenge and how that might happen. And we're not going into solution mode in my talk like we did with the previous talks. It's really a challenge for network operators to approach that, how they anonymise. But also those frameworks need to give specific details on how that anonymisation has occurred, and also describe the benefits that goes to consumers from use of that anonymised data, and how they're going to make that a secure environment. So we've looked at anonymising through aggregation, as that's specifically mentioned in the license condition, and we've looked at aggregation, and the problem with aggregation is that the more you aggregate consumption profiles, the less useful it becomes to network operators, and it's a real issue for them. Particularly when you've got rural networks with very few customers, you start to get big blind spots if you aggregate at very high levels. And in networks where you've got very few smart meters, it's the same challenge. So aggregation is really doesn't seem to be such a solution for networks. It end up with lots of parts of their networks that they can't get that visibility, that granularity that they need. None of them have put forward a framework yet for approval by the regulator, but we're not sure until one of the companies produces that framework for approval and suggests an aggregation level of 3, whether the regulator will say yes, that's sufficient to warrant it as sort of anonymised, and we think perhaps not. And certainly the ICO perspective, aggregating to a level of 2 or 3 it still means that the data is personal and subject to the DPA. So the license also mentions anonymisation by means of any other process. So they're looking at how else they can anonymise that half-hourly consumption data, and one of the ways is to store the raw data in a secure environment with restricted controlled access, and the other is to sort of store that data separately from the identifiers, the MPAN and the device ID. But whatever way they do it, they still need to reference that each half-hourly profile to a point on their network, because that's what gives them the information they need on how big the cable needs to be and what bits of the network need reinforcing, and to sort of make sure there's no power cuts and disruption in supplies and reliability to consumers connected to that network. So they're looking at how they can be compliant with SLC 10A, and and this is the only way they can currently see that they can be compliant, is to anonymise at the point of collection. So when they make the correct request to a number of meters, they will pull in that sort of and aggregate those values to a minimum amount, an acceptable amount of aggregation that sort of is accepted, and that no one's given them a number. The Ofgem hasn't said it's 10 or 9 or 11. The networks need to sort of make that argument in their privacy framework and say this is a sufficient level of aggregation to warrant it anonymised, but it's likely it's going to be a higher number, and that gives you that issue on rural areas and areas with very few number of smart meters, and they lose that visibility across a large part of their network. So this is not a great solution and a great option for networks that are, and but it's probably the one that will comply with the condition in SLC 10A. Their preferred option would be to aggregate at the point of use, and that is to store all the detailed half-hourly consumption data in a secure environment within their business, and only aggregate it on when they request it from that secure environment. And this is really important because networks change all the time, and they like to store, if they store that aggregation, that raw data, networks can change and they can still go back to the data and look at historical data and still draw value from it to understand, even with the different configuration of their network, they can still get value from that historical consumption data. So the problem is that they do have that data disaggregated in raw form in their system. So networks are very much of the mind that they see that there needs to be a balance between data privacy and the risk and the benefits that can be obtained. So, you know, what are the risks associated with that data? Who would want to get access to it, and why? And what is the potential value of the benefits that we can deliver to consumers from using that data? So we think it's also very important to understand what consumers really think about this, and we've started some engagement with consumers. There's 12 consumer forums throughout the country that's currently underway. We're sort of halfway through, and it's important that networks have those sort of discussions, and it's an independently run. We're not involved in the actual discussions with consumers. It's a totally independent research body that's doing that, and we're using the outputs from those sessions to inform each DNO's data privacy framework and put the protections that to address consumer concerns that they're telling us. But the signs are pretty good. They are not generally concerned about half-hourly consumption data being managed by a network operator once they know who a network operator is, because a lot of them confuse them with suppliers. But once they understand they're not they're a heavily regulated body, and they're not going to sell the information, and they're not kind of knock on people's doors up selling products, they're much more understanding of the need for that data and the benefits that potentially could be drawn from it to make a more reliable and efficient network. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, is this on?
I believe so. I think everybody's turned it off.
No, okay. Right.
Okay. So Kelly Muse from Tom from Roche, who's going to be talking to us about clinical trial data.
Yeah, as said, I'm going to be focusing on the pharmaceutical industry, looking at specifics of clinical trial data sharing environments so far. So looking at data transparency within pharma, there's an increase in opportunities for us. So there's a lot more data sources we can look at to develop our own clinical study reports. So clinical study reports are the real detailed reports that we submit for filings These contain the safety and efficacy data of the molecule being studied, publications that we can access, as well as right down to individual patient level data that we can access. But on the flip of this, so far pharmaceutical industries really only share data with the kind of people like the FDA, the regulators. So far, we're not used to sharing data externally, and when it has been done, it's been done on quite an ad hoc basis. So now we really need to think that all the data we generate can be shared moving forward. So when I talk about data, there's a whole plethora of data within the pharma industry, right from the very high level results registries postings such as clinicaltrials.gov, USRCT in Europe, right through to journal articles. We have the summary documents, which are multiple clinical study reports, through to the single study reports, right down to the individual patient level data of a patient within a trial. And there's increasing levels of detail as you go down, but also more controls on the accessibility of these. So industry is having to adapt fast because this is growing at a really rapid pace. One new policy that's really hit industry is European Medicines Agency Policy 70. So this is taking our clinical study reports, which are really detailed. They contain narratives, which is individual patient level data. These paint a picture of a specific patient within a trial. Normally these are patients that have had an event of interest, such as a serious adverse event. So these are really detailed reports, and they are publishing them with very limited controls on the internet. So this is resulting in a real increase in expertise required within pharma. So we need people that are experienced in anonymisation, particularly risk quantification as well. And this is going to impact the whole of how pharma actually develops a clinical trial, because we want these documents to be anonymisation ready. So we want the data to be captured in a standard method, written in a standard method, so all of these tools and technologies can do this automated, because in one filing you can have 20, 30 different individual clinical study reports, and they all need to be anonymised and all of our patients' data kept confidential. Other processes that we're needing to adapt to is when we now do the registries postings, and also when we do any kind of publications, we now need to submit the protocols, which are the plan of what we hope to achieve in a clinical trial, as well as the very detailed statistical analysis plans, how we're going to see if this trial is efficacious. Does it work? Is its safety profile good enough? Is there risk-benefit ratios? Also, returning individual results to patients, lay summaries, that's also being adapted. And I think anyone that works in industry will know that everybody's very much focused into the filing, submitting your molecule to the FDA or the EMA, getting that drug to market. So everybody's very much focused on that clinical study report and filing that molecule. However, now people need to look beyond that. There's a life for that data beyond, hence the title. And also not only looking at that data sharing externally, but also internally. Data curation, stewardship. Can we share data across project teams if that helps people to plan their new clinical study reports? Can you find the data, the supporting documents, and can it be reused by others is a really key thing in industry now. So my individual level of expertise is looking at patient level data. I work in the patient level data sharing team in Roche. I support clinical study data requests.com for Roche. This was launched Jan 2014. There's a large number of studies listed across 13 different companies, 13 sponsors. And the Wellcome Trust act as a reviewer and secretariat for the independent review panel who actually approve all of the requests, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next few slides. So as you can see, we went live in 2014, so we have had 254 research proposals submitted. However, most of these are still in progress because they normally take between 1 and 2 years to actually do their analysis. Then also they've got to submit their research to a publication, which takes time. However, we do have 5 that are published. Clinical study data request, anybody can log on. You don't need to create a user account to look at the metrics. Through the metrics, you can actually click through and see details of the research proposals. It's completely open. You can see the publications, so that's something that you can access at any time. And this is our typical data model. So researchers can actually come via two ways to us. They can come via an inquiry. So maybe they don't see the trial that they want listed on the website. Maybe they have a general question. Does it cost any money? How do we access the data? They can come via the inquiry. Or then there's the detailed research proposal that contains the lay summary, a list of all the actual studies they want to access. It contains a statistical analysis plan, as well as a publication plan. And as I said, where you have 13 different sponsors involved, if they want 20 different studies from 6 different sponsors, they can do that all in one research proposal. So they don't have to come to Roche, to GSK, to Sanofi separately. They can do it all via one research proposal. Once they've submitted that, the Wellcome Trust do an initial review. Does it make sense? Is it complete? And then the sponsors will just look to see very specific things, such as can they find the data and documents involved? Does it fit with the initial indication being studied? And then the actual approve or reject is not done by the sponsors. We don't have that kind of say-so. That's all done by the independent review panel, which sits across all of the different sponsors. You have ethics, medical, stats, and a lay person all on the team. They actually do any kind of approve, reject for individual proposals. Once it's past that point, it then is handed over to the sponsors. So it's quite independent with the Wellcome Trust and the independent review panel until it goes past the approve, reject stage. So once it's handed over to the sponsors, this is where we kind of get into the context of sharing. So we share data with a legal data sharing agreement in place. And we quite naively, when we first started this process, thought that actually anonymising the data would be the longest process. No, it's the legal part. The data sharing agreement has taken, in some cases longer than a year to agree, because you're going between different sponsors and different universities' legal departments. So that covers things such as you will not attempt to re-identify a patient, you will not try and download the data, you won't give your access to the portal to somebody else. We then move on, once we have the legal agreement in place, all of our data sets are de-identified, we create a whole package, so we don't just give the data. Clinical trial data sets are quite complex, so we also give a whole suite of supporting documents. Research is actually done by the researchers in a secure portal, so we call it like a locked box approach. So they log in through the portal, they do their analysis in their own research environment, which the sponsors don't have access to. It's completely secure for that individual researcher. And if you have, say, 5 different researchers on one proposal, they each have their own area and then a shared environment where they can share programs across. And sponsors simply upload their study data and documents, and then they pull that down into their research environment. So it's quite secure, and sponsors can't see each other's data or the actual researcher's analysis being done. And that ensures they have all their access, but then they can't download. So we have controls on downloads, so we can see what researchers are trying to attempt to download. So if they do try and download a whole study's worth of data sets, it's flagged and we can reject that. However, if they're downloading their individual analysis, a summary table, a graphic, we can approve that. Once the analysis is done, it's then sent out to publication. Okay, so as I said, clinical trial data set is quite complex. So we do a whole package that we provide access to. So you have the raw data sets. This is the data as it's captured from the case report form. So age, height, weight, race. You have the analysis data sets. Both of these are in an anonymised format. The protocol, as I said, which is a plan of what the clinical trial is going to achieve. The case report form, how that data is being captured. Data set specifications, so that will detail that the variable on that specific data set came from page number 7 on the annotated case report form, so you can see right back and traceability of that data. The statistical analysis plan saying how these analysis data sets were derived. the dataset specs, which also go into that kind of detail, and then the clinical study report, as I said, which details, you know, the safety and efficacy results of the trial, but that's done in a redacted format. So things such as patient narratives in that case are removed. Okay, so looking at the specifics of the anonymisation that we perform on the data sets, we wanted an efficient, secure process, whilst we still have the benefit of maintaining that patient confidentiality. So we developed a program in Macro which does this, so we can easily replicate this. For example, one clinical trial could have, say, up to 80 data sets that we have to push through that anonymisation process. And if for one research proposal you're sharing, I think the most done is 12 different trials, so 12 times 80, you've got to get efficient at doing this. And I think the one thing is most pharmaceutical companies are a blend of many original companies. We have Roche, we have Genentech. So you have many different clinical trial data models. So the data sets are not one structure. You have old models, you have new models. You work with contract houses, they have a different data model. So this anonymisation macro must be flexible to look at all of these different structures. Okay, so the things that, looking at some of the specifics it does, people sometimes say to me, well, it doesn't say Kelly Muse from the UK, it says patient number 112. That's already anonymised. However, when you start to look at patient 112 through centre number 564, you then go on to see the centre number 564 only actually has 3 patients. Very quickly you start to narrow down who that patient is and you can actually re-identify. So even though our clinical trial data sets look like they're anonymised, we'll still recode those patient and centre IDs. And small sites, so the small centres will be grouped, so there's a minimum of 10 patients within a group. Remove older patients, that their ages are categorised, so anybody over the age of 89. But we also, as well as dropping the variables that could reveal patient identity, we do look in detail to see that we keep the data utility, because we're sharing in a secure environment, we're sharing with data controls in place, legal controls. We do try and keep a real balance of the data utility and having that scientific, you know, meaningfulness. Dates are converted to study days, other sponsors do a date offset, and where we can, we also apply controlled terminology. So instead of having free text, which is really risky, we'll try and remove any kind of free text and put in a controlled terminology. So medical history, adverse events, race, things like that are always grouped. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the speakers who kept to the 13 minutes I've allocated them, which meant we've nicely catched up for the slack speakers this morning who went over their time. And in fact, Kelly's slide is excellent, was what we want to say. Now, Joseph's dying because he was wanting to ask a question to the first speaker, so please go ahead, Joseph.
Well, yeah, in fact, thank you for the presentations. They were extremely interesting because you seldom see the actual data holders explaining what they do. So regarding second presentation from Privitar, I think I completely agree with the remarks that have been made. I must say that for non-rectangular data, there are some techniques that are available, like for graphs at the moment. Even we have some incipient techniques for unstructured text, but we have hardly anything for multimedia, for example. And that's the sad reality. So at the moment, what we have is solving the problems we had 20 years ago, when the only data holders were national statistical offices, but no longer the problems we have nowadays. And I will discuss this in my presentation this afternoon. So thank you for that. And then regarding first presentation, there was a mention of random numbers being used to anonymize or pseudonymize. My question is whether these random numbers are fixed for the same subject, or whether they are really random every time. Are you reusing randomness or not?
That's a question. So on the first randomization, we used a fixed number into that data. Basically, it will change over time slowly, as it likes to. But on the second extraction, before we data process, that's different for every single data extraction. So there's no persistence between data extractions.
No way to link.
There's no-
Okay, that's it. Yeah.
So far we haven't found.
Okay. And then another question I had for Paul Abreu. When discussing aggregation, you say that it is no good, but why isn't aggregation by geography enough for you? For example, if you have a section or a block or several blocks, why isn't it enough to aggregate by geography?
Because the usefulness of the information is purely about where along a cable length the load exists. So if you aggregate a large area,
No.
you lose that focus on where along that cable the stress point might be or the hotspot might be. So it's not true for everything, but you lose a lot of usefulness if you aggregate large areas because you're actually pulling away from the asset you're interested in. And there's lots of, a network is made up of lots of assets interconnected, and it's specific elements of those assets that the networks are interested in, and that's what the data is.
But for small areas, you could have concentrators that automatically aggregate the data from consumers, and that wouldn't harm you, or would it?
As long as you've got enough consumers in that small area. If you've just got two down a country lane,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to,
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I agree.
to aggregate. So in a city where you may have 10 Victorian houses and each house has got 5 flats in it, it's really easy to do. And that's not an issue. They can aggregate to 20 if they want, and they still get the value from the data. But the issues around large proportions of the network have few customers on it because most of it's rural, and the urban areas are concentrated, and they're
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, absolutely brilliant presentations. Thank you very much. I have a general question to sort of anyone. So certainly in the financial industry, very recently, there's huge drives about the whole concept of who owns the data, and certainly there's I think is it PSD2 directives that basically say about sharing of financial information. Do you think some form of regulation along that sort of line that will help govern and say that the consumer can start to say who gets what? Do you think that will help with some of the challenges associated with anonymisation, or do you think it's going to hinder? Or how do you think? Do you think regulation is possibly the answer?
Jason?
I can comment on that. So I think regulation is certainly helpful in focusing the minds. I think a lot of organisations they view this as a risk mitigation exercise, just like security, and that enables them to put a number on it. And having regulatory fines enables them to put a number on it, and that's often how things get done in large enterprises. I think one of the important things about consent is if consent is withdrawn, then the data lake will freeze over, if you like, and organisations won't be able to do anything. So it will be very strongly in their interests to educate consumers, to inform them on what is going on, to give them the opportunity to opt out, as Brendan talked about, and to get their buy-in effectively. And then they will be able to usefully use this data. So there needs to be this contract really between organisations and their consumers.
I can see. I totally agree with you, because without any of this data, nothing would get done. You just wouldn't have the industries just wouldn't have any information to do anything with. But the problem is there's always that inherent trust, especially when you start talking about bandy around the words like big pharma. The moment you turn around and say Fincom and pharma, oh no, they can't have my data. Yet you don't realise these guys are developing drugs and things that are saving lives. So I think you're right. The problem is it's an education problem then, as well as regulation perhaps.
Which I think is a lot of the subject of tomorrow's workshop.
Right.
I have a question for Kelly.
Fine.
Right, how do you deal with when you have a request to share genomic data associated to the clinical trial? Could you say a bit more on that or not?
That would currently fall us out. So image analysis, any kind of images and genomic data, they currently fall out of scope, particularly any request through clinicalstudydatarequest.com, because we kind of term that as that would be a sharing with strangers approach. Obviously we do work with collaborations, so we term those sharing with friends. So in those cases there is genomic, but that's very much we have strong legal controls in place. We still would look to share in a secure manner as the data transfer, and we have no controls that, from my knowledge, imaging and genomic data is out of scope for all the sponsors via CSDR.
All right.
Purely because I think it's so sensitive. There are, kind of industry collaborations going on. There's things such as the HLI, which is Human Longevity Inc., who we're working with. They're obviously doing large-scale sequencing for us. So there is a lot of that going on, but I think it will move forward, I guess. At the moment, I think sponsors are probably playing safe.
Thank you.
Yeah, right, so I've got Bernhard Waugh from GE Healthcare. So I've got a question around consent and the withdrawal of consent specifically. I think we seem to be in a stage where data is being used for many more purposes, as we've seen today in some great presentations for very good purposes. But do the customers supplying that data know that that's going on? And is there a time in the next few years where they'll realise the data is being used for this and they want to withdraw consent? And how do we then ensure that they can withdraw consent and stop the use of that data? So I think, from the very different example, I'm not sure if you have a way of taking that data back out of the lake once it's been encrypted in the first place. What do we do there?
Revocation mechanisms? Yeah?
So right now, we can only remove at the source of the data, right? So when somebody's opted out, they opt out to the point they opt out. But we designed the system to be anonymised. We can't retrospectively opt people out of the data set. But the data doesn't persist forever. We only keep a finite window, and that changes over time, and that's how we've currently designed the system. It may become more important in the future, and if it is, we'll have to redesign it. But then it opens up additional risks, right? If you can go in and identify an individual in the data set at rest.
Lady at the back.
Jackie Taylor, Flame Binary. I just wanted to make a statement on PSD2. The new regulation, which are enforceable from October 2017 in financial services, actually take account of some of this, because the original PSD legislation actually didn't allow for the audit and the denotion of compliance to really be investigated by the regulators. So there is a change in terms of the correspondent banks and what they need to do. I don't doubt that there's an education process to do, but it's more onerous on the correspondent bank to be able to demonstrate compliance now, and in terms of the way in which they can do it. So that's I just wanted to say that PSD2 piece. Happy to talk to anybody who wants some more. But the central banks in each of the, either in our own case, Bank of England or ECB, have taken steps as well, so it's not just with the correspondent banks for PSD2. I had a question for Paul regarding the smart metering. I understand what you've described. I was surprised from a DNO point of view that the DNOs are looking at this as an initiative, because as we move forwards with the Internet of Things and we move forward with smart grid being not just in charge, or not the DNOs not just being in charge of smart grid, and as our own generation capacity, isn't this just going to leave a gap? Because essentially, yes, whatever the arguments will end up being about the smart grid from a DNO point of view, we've got an alternative generation capacity that we're building, not just in this country but across Europe. And so we'll never have the answers by just doing what you described, even though smart metering has been mandated. So I just wanted to know about the alternative generation capacity and how that would feed into what you're doing.
Paul had a slight problem hearing what you were saying. Could you kind of give a one-sentence question?
Yeah. So in terms of the initiative the DNOs are doing, how does that take account of the alternative generation capacity that is on the rise? Because even if we get across all the risks associated with what they're planning to do, we won't ever have the answer to smart grid, because there's alternative generation being created.
I mean, that's the issue that networks are trying to prepare for, is they are seen as the vehicle to